Havana, Cuba. The year was 1946. All the mob bosses from across America had been summoned by Charlie Lucky Luciano for a huge sit-down. The last time a major sit-down like this one was held was all the way back in 1929. In the year of 1929, the world of organized crime changed forever. The old days of gangsters from different communities ruling their various territories and rackets alone were over. Luciano with all the Italians, Meyer Lansky with all the Jewish mobsters, and people like Nucky Johnson with all the Irish gangsters had come together. These men were now united. They were together and had one goal in mind. These men came together to build an empire. The last convention before Havana, Cuba in 1946 was when these men organized crime in 1929 and again in 1932. They used Lansky's honeymoon as a cover in 1929. Lansky showed up alongside his wife to enjoy a nice honeymoon. What she did not know was that in the background, the elite of the elite in organized crime was also in attendance for their very own first national conference. The list of people that showed up in 1929 and were in attendance was Capone, who arrived from Chicago with Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, King Solomon drives down from Boston, Boo Boo Hoff, Waxy Gordon and Nig Rosen came up from Philadelphia. From Cleveland came Mo Dalitz and his allies Lou Rothkopf and Charles Polizzi, real name Leo Berkowitz, adopted son of the mafia-affiliated Polizzi family. A whole delegation of the Purple Gang came from Detroit doing the bidding of its leader Abe Bernstein. Boss Tom Pendergast of Kansas City sent a surrogate John Lazia. Longy Zwillman and Willie Moretti represented New York-Nassau County and northern New Jersey. The largest was from New York, which was Lucky, Vito, Meyer, Torrio, Costello, Lepke, Adonis and Frank Erickson, still in mourning for the loss of Arnold Rothstein, Dutch Schultz from Brooklyn, Albert Anastasia, Vince Mangano and Frank Scalise. The old dons Masseria and Maranzano were not invited by Lucky. Johnson arranged suites at the Breakers, however this place was exclusively for Protestants. Johnson had made the names in Anglo-Saxon aliases, but one look at Capone and the rest was enough to realize these men were not no Protestants, and they were refused rooms. This embarrassed Nucky. A hurried call was made to Johnson. When Nucky Johnson arrived, Al Capone squared up to Johnson, and both men started cursing at each other. Nucky was famous for his four-letter words. He was known to invent his own. Nucky and Al had it out right there in the open. Eventually it was all sorted out. Johnson was about a foot taller than Capone, and both had voices like foghorns. Charlie would say, "I think you could have heard them in Philadelphia and there was not a decent word passed between them." Johnson had a rep for four-letter words that was not even invented. And Capone is screaming at me that I have made bad arrangements. So Nucky picks up Al under one arm and throws him into his car and yells out, "All you fuckers follow me!" Capone and the guests were taken to the Ritz Hotel, behind which Johnson's own mansion loomed, and it had the ambassador next door. That was all the way back in the 1930s, and now 16 years later things had changed. Charlie was jailed in 1936, and he had spent 10 years in a prison cell. By the time he got out, the tide was turning against him, and he was exiled back to Italy. And it would be from there where he would plot his return to either Havana or America, and in December 1946 he was halfway to accomplishing that goal. Things had changed while he was in jail. Some men were dead like Abe Raylers, Lepke and Dutch Schultz. The world had changed. The Second World War meant Britain's empire was collapsing. The war left all of Europe destabilized and poor, so they started looking for investment. In the 50s, Churchill would write letters begging Truman and Eisenhower for investment into the United Kingdom. Some of the people who would answer those calls were people who involved in banking as well as organized crime. Both groups invested piles of cash into Europe, especially London. The world of banking and organized crime would clash in a huge way, creating a new criminal syndicate called the Banking Mafia. In the year 1946, Luciano was in Havana and finally enjoying life after a long sentence in prison and an uncomfortable trip to Italy. Luciano would land in Havana, Cuba in the month of October. The commission meeting was due to be held on the 22nd of December. In my documentary I will talk more about this meeting and what it meant for the Mafia and its consequences for the future. This meeting showed us the Mafia had already conquered America. They had also conquered other parts of the globe such as Cuba, Havana, as well as the Bahamas and Latin America. The mafia were even moving into parts of the Middle East. The CIA saw this expansion in the early 40s and took full advantage of it in the 50s. The Second World War had ended, and these men now looked at the world and wanted to find new industries to invest in. Gambling was under their control. America's vital industries were mob-controlled. The mafia were no longer a criminal organization. They had morphed into a banking criminal syndicate. These men financed major businesses, industries, and utilities. They were some of the richest men in the world. They had their meetings in private. They were now capable of having them in countries that were under their control, like Havana, Cuba. The day of the meeting started to get nearer, with more guests arriving as the day came closer. December 22nd was the day of the meeting. These men were leading the world of organized crime. It was only the Italian La Cosa Nostra that were having their meeting. However, a few Jewish mobsters were also invited. The upper 4 floors of the Hotel Nacional de Cuba had been booked for these men exclusively. No members of the public could get access to them. This meeting would be different from the meeting that was held in Atlantic City. For example, in Atlantic City, these gentlemen showed up with their girlfriends or their wives. However, at this meeting in 1946, no girlfriends and no wives were invited for the first few days. A day or two before Christmas, they were allowed to bring their wives or girlfriends over, but the first few days were strictly business. From New York and New Jersey came Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, Joe Bananas, Frank Costello, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Profaci, and his heir apparent Giuseppe Magliocco, Willie Moretti, Augie Pisano, and Mike Miranda. From Buffalo, there was Steve Magadino, the Bufalino family, as well as members of the Ciandra family. Chicago sent its council chief, Tony Accardo, and the Fischetti brothers, Charlie Fischetti and Rocco Fischetti, cousins and heirs of Al Capone. Al Capone was out of prison. However, he was dying of syphilis. Al Capone was the most famous mobster in the world. He would die in January 1947. The news would reach Luciano in Havana. Charlie was upset, but Costello did not mind it too much. He saw the future with Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo. Carlos Marcello arrived from New Orleans, and Santo Traficante came from Florida. Carlos was holding down the interests of Louisiana and the South regarding gambling, casinos, and more. He built a lucrative relationship with Vito Genovese through a mutual interest in the business of narcotics. The Genovese family purchased some of its heroin straight from the Louisiana outfit. Carlos walked in with Frank Costello and sat close to him. Luciano said one thing about Santo Traficante. He said this was one gentleman that even Meyer Lansky would never tangle with, and he always hogged the background. There were 2 high-ranking Jewish delegates present also, however. They did not have no vote but were present at that meeting. It was Meyer Lansky and Phil Castell. There were quite a few more men that were present at this meeting. He mentioned the name of Carlos Marcello. This was the first and only time Charlie would mention that name, simply because Marcello's name was now all over the papers, especially during the 60s and especially during 1951. Another factor being Silver Dollar Sam, who was deported before Luciano. Sam was deported in the year of 1945. That's when Carlos Marcello became boss. So when Luciano was eventually deported in 1946, he was close to and always met up with Silver Dollar Sam. He knew if he ever mentioned the Louisiana Mafia or spoke about Carlos Marcello, Silver Dollar Sam would be terribly upset. Charlie always kept their names out of his mouth. Silver Dollar Sam was living in Italy. He was one gentleman that was heavily involved in the world of narcotics. In fact, one of his main customers was Carlos Marcello back in New Orleans. Back in 1946, these men were the richest men in America, and they were coming together to discuss future interests and how they were going to move into the decade that was coming up, which was the 50s. They also wanted to come together to figure out a way of getting Luciano back into America. At this meeting, he did one major thing also that contributed to the history of organized crime. He brought back the position of boss of bosses. Charlie at this meeting declared himself the boss of bosses, a position he had retired himself when he murdered Maranzano. This suggestion was not actually brought up by Charlie Luciano. It was done for him by Albert Anastasia. Albert brought it up, and then Charlie took it from there and went on to declare himself the boss of bosses. and everyone at that meeting from every state accepted him as the capo di tutti capi. Another thing that was a major issue was the fact that Benjamin Siegel had been wasting a lot of money in what they thought was a wasteful venture, a casino in the desert of Vegas. They also had the perfect cover for this occasion. If anyone was going to ask why this meeting was occurring, they used one of the perfect excuses ever. In fact, they had one of the most famous men in America backing them. His name was Frank Sinatra. If anyone asked why this meeting ever occurred or why it happened or what was going on, they would state they all got together to celebrate a New Jersey kid who had done good because of these men in organized crime. All of them were extremely proud of Frank Sinatra. He had achieved the big fame. The mob backed Frank Sinatra in the early days. Charlie Luciano and his men would have a brief party with Frank Sinatra. It was like a celebration for them. The cover was the fact that it was the celebration of Sinatra's achievements. However, behind closed doors, these guys knew it was a celebration for the return of Luciano. They just used Frank Sinatra as a front. Before the meeting even got started, some of these men had come early and came to Luciano's private house and met with him. Most of these men were just showing up to reaffirm their loyalty to Luciano, to give him reports about what was going on, what their thoughts were, and what they thought they could improve. Some of these men were people like Carlos Marcello, Tony Accardo, Santo Trafficante, Anastasia, and many others. Most of the men also would show up just to let Luciano know that they would always consider him the true head of the organization. Luciano will look at them and test the waters regarding what Vito Genovese had been saying to them. Most will stand firm and always say they acknowledged Luciano as the boss of the Luciano outfit. So it was at that moment in time, after that day, a little party was due to be held. The party's cover was Frank Sinatra. They wanted to throw a party in honor of him, but truly the man that they were honoring was Charlie Luciano and his return. There was plenty of food, beautiful women, and they celebrated all the way up until the last day of the week. And the Havana newspapers never printed a single word about these men being there. The dinner night was hosted by Lansky, Costello, and Adonis. This was another public show of affirmations, making sure everyone knew Luciano was still boss of bosses of his own outfit. Once that had been set and everything had been done, the gentlemen started to come forward and offer Luciano the envelopes they brought with them, which were filled with cash. It was now December. It started to get nearer to the day of December 22nd, the day of the meeting. More guests would be arriving. These men were the men who were leading the world of organized crime. From New York and New Jersey came Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, Joe Bonanno, Frank Costello, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Profaci, and his heir apparent Giuseppe Magliocco, Willie Moretti, Augie Pisano, and Mike Miranda. From Buffalo there was Stefano Magadino, Russell Bufalino, Miami and Florida. There was Jimmy Blue Eyes, who was aligned with Meyer and Russell Bufalino. Chicago sent its council chief, Tony Accardo, and the brothers Fischetti, which were Charlie and Rocco. They were the cousins and heirs of Al Capone. Al Capone was out of jail. However, he was dying of syphilis. Al Capone would die in January 1947. Charlie would be in Havana when he got the news, and sent his regards to his family, especially his son and cousins. Carlos Marcello arrived from New Orleans, and Santo Trafficante came from Florida. Carlos was holding down the interests of Louisiana and the South. Carlos walked in with Frank Costello and sat close to him. Luciano said one thing about Santo Trafficante. He said, "This was one gentleman that even Meyer Lansky would never tangle with, and he always hogged the background even more than Meyer." There were two high-ranking Jewish delegates that did not have no vote, but were present at that meeting. They were Meyer Lansky, and another one was Phil Dandy Castell. There were quite a few more men that were present at his meeting, but Luciano refused to mention their names. It had been more than a decade since the last meeting. The last meeting that was held that was of this importance was in 1932, when Luciano got everyone together and organized crime. 14 years had now passed. New bosses were sitting at that table. New people like Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, who was close with Scalise and Gambino as well as Luciano, was also sat at the table. He was leading his father's outfit as his dad was in old age and enjoying retirement. Luciano was one of the most powerful men in America at that moment in time. He was sat at the head of that table. Next to him was Frank Costello and Adonis. On the other side was Lansky and Genovese. If you just look at those four men, you could say Luciano's outfit was on another level. Frank Costello was the man who corrupted all of politics and helped create people like Carlos Marcello. Adonis was a powerhouse in New York. Next to him was Meyer Lansky, the man who was the mathematician of the mafia, a money-laundering genius. And then he had the pitbull, that was Genovese. For the rest of the men, there was no protocol they get to sit where they wanted. At this meeting, these men were coming together to discuss the new layout of organized crime. However, a discussion would be held that would go down in the history of gambling and entertainment. The meeting started pleasantly till this subject came up. The meeting then took a serious tone. A certain old friend had to be discussed. He had not been invited to this meeting simply because he was the point of the meeting occurring. A lot of the mob bosses from around America had invested into his project, and it had all gone wrong. It would be Lansky who would stand up and start off the new topic of conversation at the meeting, and it was regarding this old situation that had been festering for some time. Meyer refers to it as the Siegel situation. However, Luciano and Meyer Lansky knew he would eventually find out that the meeting did occur. Lansky highlighted Benjamin Siegel's new business operation. He called Benjamin's new venture a sleazy Nevada oasis in Las Vegas. It is stunning to see that none of these men saw what Benjamin Siegel saw in Las Vegas, or maybe Meyer Lansky did and wanted to take it from him. In 1946, Las Vegas was like a stopping-off place for east and westbound travelers. They would stop off if they ever needed warm food or a refueling stop. Trivial things like that. Vegas was where they would stop off, just before they would head out and complete the rest of their journey through the desert road. The mob were already in the state of Nevada, however. They were moving into places like Reno, where there was a local population, where there was some sort of tourism that it could then build up off. They never knew or saw the potential of the Vegas desert. Siegel did not want Reno. He saw it as an old town filled with old people. He had no interest in that. He saw the future in the Vegas desert. He wanted not just to build a casino, but he wanted to then build some sort of hotel that would then facilitate the people at the casino. He would provide them with entertainment, food, the best chefs, the best gambling, the best entertainment. Every big star would be there. He would provide them with movie actors and singers, the dancers. A whole show would go on as well as casinos. This was a smart business plan simply because by offering a hotel, everyone that worked at the casino would be staying, sleeping, and living in the casino. So whatever money they would earn from the casino would eventually be poured back into the casino. You could even put people who were specialist dancers and singers into your debt, and forever have them working for your casino and never have them leave simply because they owed too much money to you or to the casino. He envisioned what Vegas would eventually turn into. Benjamin Siegel was adamant he could build a new city like this that could rival some of the best tourist locations in the world. He wanted to create Las Vegas as we know it today. When he first thought of this idea, Luciano was sitting at Great Meadow. He had just been released from Dannemora and was working with the Americans in regard to helping them with naval intelligence. That is when Siegel reached out to him and asked for an investment. It was in around 1943 when he started to make the moves to get involved in Las Vegas. So in around 1943 is when Benjamin Siegel started to build that casino. He would call it the Flamingo. He named it that because Benjamin Siegel owned a share of a racetrack in Florida. He saw the flamingos there and he liked them. He thought that would be the perfect name for his casino. Benjamin Siegel also saw the flamingos as a good sign. So he did not just adopt the name, he adopted the color, and with him and Virginia Hill both together would start to make the very first casino hotel. He started his operation in 1943 and all the way through till 1946. That was the only thing he wanted to do. He would neglect all the other issues and solely focused on building the Flamingo. However, Benjamin was smart and a realist. He knew that he needed more than tables and good gambling to tempt the customers from Reno and other cities. So that is when he made his genius idea. He wanted to offer them not just the best food and the best wines, but he wanted to offer them the most luxurious accommodation at the best prices, as well as inviting in Hollywood stars. Nobody would be able to say no to Las Vegas. He would create a billion-dollar empire that is worth a fortune even today. But at the time Siegel was building his casino, it was not a suitable time to be involved in a construction project, especially in the middle of nowhere. America was gearing up for the Second World War. A lot of necessities were now being given to the government to help prepare for war. So, Benjamin needed to find alternative ways of getting the goods he needed to build his casino, such as steel and other goods. He would reach out to his mob friends to secure the construction goods needed to build his hotel. He used the mafia to put pressure on the Teamsters Union and other places where they had control to get the trucks flowing and to get the goods straight to the desert, where he could then use them to build the casino. An issue started to rise for Siegel and his business partners. He was in constant need of more money, always asking and shaking down various people. He would even go to legitimate people in Beverly Hills and Los Angeles and shake them down, promising them shares in the casino. This eventually would lead to his downfall, because some of these legitimate people then wanted those books to be opened so they could look at where the money went. The mob did not want this because that legitimate money was mixed up with their illegitimate money. The mob needed to always control the books, so Siegel, by hustling legitimate people and hustling the mob, was dancing with death. The legitimate people who had invested a lot of money into Benjamin Siegel's operation started to complain about the prolonged delays as well as the fact that the casino never was opening on time. They sought to look at the finances and where the money was going. This triangle of people was being led by an executive of American distillers named Samuel Rothberg and his brother C. Harry Rothberg. Both men had put in $250,000, and in 1943, that was a lot of money. The people who were at that meeting in Havana, Cuba, knew a lot about these affairs. They had been kept informed by Frank Costello, as well as Lansky and other people who were keeping an eye on Benjamin and his business operations. You must bear in mind people like Carlos Marcello, Santo Traficante and others had built casinos in states where it was illegal. Marcello was in Louisiana, and through him, Costello, Phil Castell, Seymour Weiss had built up to 20 to 30 casinos with hotels in major buildings with huge historical significance. The South was becoming the home of casinos for Marcello and his people. The Southern Mafia and more thought it were crazy to build a casino in the desert. These men never saw his vision, nor did they believe in his vision. And they didn't like the fact that their money was being drilled in by a Jewish mobster, especially people like Carlos Marcello, who had invested a lot of money into Vegas through Frank Costello, the Chicago outfit, and all the other outfits who had come together to build this operation. All their money was now being fangled by Benjamin Siegel. They held their tongue out of respect for Luciano. They knew Luciano loved Siegel, so out of respect to him, they left the situation alone. If the hotel was a success, if that casino made a lot of money, they were happy to let the situation go. But Benjamin Siegel's life at that moment in time depended on his casino being a success. There was another subtle issue that was also bothering some of these mobsters. Benjamin was skimming a lot of money that was being sent to him for construction costs. Meyer had heard through various sources that Siegel had private bank accounts in Zurich with Virginia Hill. They both had set up the accounts to hide some of the stolen cash, and she was making regular trips over there to deposit some of the cash. She had also taken out a luxury apartment in Switzerland. She had a huge wardrobe up there with a bunch of clothes. The clothes were necessary simply because what these people would do was stuff their pockets, and they are underclothes with a lot of money and their suitcases with a lot more money. Then they just walked through private security and got on a private plane to wherever they needed to go and deposit that money in safe havens like Switzerland. That is how some people hid their money in the early days. Meyer had people check out her apartment and her wardrobe, and it made sense to him. That was what was going on. He looked at the books and came to an accumulation of $300,000 going missing. He contacted his people in Switzerland, and they informed him that there was a similar account held with $300,000 in it, and the depositor had been Virginia Hill. These men had been taking a loss that was worth over $147 million in today's money. They were upset about it, but they were not devastated. That shows you how deep their pockets were. Charlie would say, There was no doubt in Maya's mind that Bugsy had skimmed this dough from the building budget, and he was sure that Siegel was preparing to skip as well as skim in case the roof was going to fall in on him. Everybody listened very closely while Lansky explained it. When he got through, somebody asked, "What do you think we ought to do?" Maya will look at Luciano and then look back at the table and say there is only one thing they can do, especially with someone who is a friend and who steals from them. Lansky simply stated, Benjamin Siegel had to be hit. He simply said there is only one thing to do with a thief who steals from friends. Benjamin had to go at that moment in time. It was setting out a standard. Maya wanted to show these Italian men that Jewish gangster moved with class, that if anyone stole from any friends, they would deal with them with utter ruthlessness. Maya expected them to be killed. Charlie at that moment in time knew that Benjamin and Maya had a subtle beef. However, he also knew he never had a full grasp on the full situation and put his trust into Maya Lansky. So with that judgment coming from Maya Lansky, Luciano then put it to a vote. Charlie then said, so, it was put to a vote. Naturally, Maya and Phil Castile didn't have any votes, but that didn't make any difference. The result was unanimous, and Bugsy was good as dead. Then it was decided that the contract should be handled by Charlie Fischetti, and he said he would be in touch with Jack Dragner on the coast. Jack was the outfit's man number 2 guy in Los Angeles under Bugsy, and that wouldn't cut no ice because he would do what he was ordered. Then Maya got up again and said he recommended that the hit shouldn't be made until after the Flamingo opened. If the place was a success, there were ways to take care of Benny for stealing without bumping him off, and he could be made to pay back the money. Benny had been a valuable guy for a long time, almost from the beginning with me and Lansky and Costello, so none of us really wanted to see him get it. But if the Flamingo was a flop, well, that would be it for him. After having a couple of more tense discussions and after a few more huge meetings were held, the tense discussions left the men at that table feeling tired. Then came the 26th of December, Boxing Day, the day Benjamin Siegel's fate would be decided. This is what Charlie had to say. Then it came to the day of December 26th. The delegates again gathered back together in the conference room. But this time it was not for a meeting. They all got together to hear the news of the casino that was supposed to be opening in Las Vegas. They wanted to hear the news about the Flamingo and what was going on. The time difference was about 3 hours. So was it right after midnight on the 27th, when the telephone reports about the long-awaited opening started to arrive, and the news was not good. The weather was extremely bad. It was cold and raining. Lansky would pull Luciano to one side and say, Charlie, with that kind of weather, only a miracle can save the Flamingo. And there's something else I must tell you. Before I left New York, I asked some questions about opening a hotel the day after Christmas, and some people in show business laughed at me. They said the week between Christmas and New Year's is like death row as far as entertainment is concerned. Charlie knew Maya was right. He would give his final view on the matter. I knew Maya was right. Benny was so desperate to make a showing he took the big chance to beat the odds-on show business. Of course, he did have one thing going for him, a terrific show. I hoped against hope that maybe all his talent would attract business and bail Benny out. Benjamin Siegel did not make it a success. However, he did try his damn hardest. He had managed to bring people like George Jessel, a master of ceremonies, Xavier Cugat and his band to provide the music. He had Jimmy Durante and George Raft starring in the show and to meet and greet the customers. But at 3 a.m. in Havana, a telephone call to Lansky revealed that almost no one had come to see and listen or gamble at the Flamingo, and it had been a flop. Even though the celebrities were there, the people who never came through the doors were the normal, average, day-to-day customers. The people that Benjamin Siegel wanted to attract, they felt that it was just too expensive to show up, that it was not aimed at people like them. Siegel had advertised his business as being the best hotel and the best casino with the best food, so the average person thought there was no way on God's green earth they were able to pay those prices. The casino at that moment in time turned out to be a massive flop. Maya took his time, but the news started to spread around, and all the mob bosses were furious. Their rage boiled over and they were loud voices heard screaming at each other about Siegel and what he got up to. It was a flat-out ruling. These mob bosses wanted him dead. You must understand, these men in today's money had invested up to 147 million into a casino in the desert. They had built casinos in states where it was illegal for far less. Some more bosses at that meeting flat out said that they wanted to send a hit team straight away to Siegel to clip him at once. However, Lansky advised caution. He recommended just a short-term delay. He said the fact that this was also a legal issue, that certain men like Samuel C. Rothberg wanted to open the books and look at certain situations regarding the finances of the Flamingo, and that could be a devastating blow. The Mafia did not want to attract attention like that. Meyer was a white-collar criminal. Meyer knew exactly what to do to get his hands back on that casino. He knew exactly the strings he needed to pull. He was a legal gangster. Meyer knew how to work a way through a contract. He said that the Flamingo should explore the suitability of throwing the hotel cooperation into bankruptcy. This, he said, would put a stop to the losses. Then the outfit could form a new association to buy out the original cooperation and its creditors at pennies on the dollar. These mobsters thought this was just a pointless idea, simply because that there was no hope in Vegas. They did not see the point of it. However, Meyer did see the point of it. Lansky still had complete faith in Siegel's vision. That was Las Vegas. It could be turned into a gambling goldmine. It was just a matter of going about it the right way. Meyer knew how to be convincing. He managed to convince the mob to make a move and to clip Benjamin Siegel. Now he was going to make a move and make them get reconvinced in backing the idea again. They had just poured millions down the drain. Yet Meyer managed to reconvince them to put a couple more million into the casino so he could then run the operations, and put the Chicago outfit as well as New York outfit and others in place to then maintain it. Siegel would be given a second chance. Lansky knew deep down Siegel would fail and then would be taken out, and the casino operations would eventually be handed over to him. He immediately set to work on this plan. By the middle of January, the Flamingo was closed, and then new money was poured in by the underworld to put it into shape before a second opening. As for Benny Siegel, he had been saved for that moment. However, once the paperwork and the white-collar criminal stuff had been sorted out, Benjamin's head would then be blown out in a Beverly Hills apartment. A new world was opening for the Mafia, and that was the world of gambling and entertainment. They were now going to take over Vegas completely. The money being made from gambling was astronomical. They did not need to look far. They saw what Marcello was doing in Louisiana. Luciano would look at the gambling in Louisiana and the South and say, "We knew it was worth it for us, Louisiana. New Orleans was worth its money. For us it was platinum." Carlos Marcello was made by New York. Frank Costello was the one who created the inroads in 1932. He was already making slow moves into Louisiana, but in 1932 Frank had Huey Long with him. Costello states he made the final deal with Huey Long on some major casinos being opened in New Orleans. He already had 2 established there. Then in 1935, Long was assassinated. He was shot, and the gunman was shot dead by his bodyguards. Huey Long left his Roosevelt Hotel. That hotel was owned by Costello, Luciano, and the other Mafia bosses. Seymour Weiss ran the gambling operations. He was one of the last men to see Huey Long alive. Seymour was a member of the Jewish Mafia and friends with Luciano and Costello. Huey never made it back. His death was extremely controversial. It benefited organized crime the most. Silver Dollar Sam's people may have paid the doctors off and they bungled the diagnosis. Long then died. Everything was run by Long's family, who were controlled by the mob. Carlos Marcello was the apprentice of Frank Costello, Seymour Weiss and Phil Castell, as well as the Todaro family. When Costello came to Louisiana, he loved seeing the corruption in Louisiana. It was as strong as Chicago. The deal was made with Huey Long and Costello. Huey would let Costello and his men, the Italian Mafia, run and build the gambling operations. Casinos poured into the South. Places such as the Roosevelt Club, the Beverly Club, and more started popping up all over the South. Millions were being invested into the South, then bang, Huey Long is murdered. The Louisiana Mafia was waiting for Costello when he came to Louisiana. Costello was a Don. Vito was on the in Italy. Meyer was building operations in Havana, Benjamin in LA. So, Costello goes alone. He calls a few Jewish mobsters, he gets Phil Castell, and contacts the Todaro family, and they send Carlos Marcello. A huge meeting is held where new deals are lined out to bring in other states that aligned Louisiana. Marcello was tasked to getting them to start in those territories. In the 50s, his men had reached Dallas. Charlie and Costello did not care who ran Louisiana. They knew they had platinum when Huey Long was alive. The mafia were pouring in millions into his pockets. Those payments came in every month. Charlie said, "We were practically buying long solid gold pants, but we didn't care for us. Louisiana, New Orleans was platinum." Marcello was cut in around the early 40s. He had to report to a lot of powerful people like Luciano, Costello, Phil Castell and Seymour Wise. He shot the profits up to a huge amount. He made about $2 billion every year from Louisiana, with it going to New York and the Louisiana crime families. In 1945, Silver Dollar Sam was being exiled. He started looking for someone to lead the family. He knew deep down there was only one man who could fill that role. A powerhouse was born. Marcello would meet Luciano in Havana, Cuba in 1946. Luciano said he called all the shots in the South. Carlos and his families from around the South were feared. His name would back anyone off from the South. They could do anything at any time, and what made them more dangerous is Carlos Marcello always moved with New York till the 60s. The Kennedy administration changed that. The Valachi hearings was a turning point in organized crime history. Costello needed a man to rule over the gambling and investments pouring into Louisiana. Luciano was battling a long prison sentence. Maya ran to Havana, and Costello had Phil Castell, Seymour Weiss, and a few others in Louisiana. But things in Louisiana can go bad quick. Frank Costello started to rely on Marcello. Marcello was already a capo, bringing in a fortune. He was charismatic, charming, polite, like Luciano. Carlos hated the old ways, loved food, hunting and shooting. Marcello hated leaving the South. He rarely, if ever, left. He was a Southerner through and through. Carlos was brash in public and extremely charitable towards his state. His brothers were talented chefs. In fact, they were professional chefs. The restaurants his brothers owned and worked in were famous. One of Marcello's brothers appeared on Louisiana local live TV, cooking for the host live on air and showing off what he can do. His wife was old school. She was hands-on with the family operations. The entire family despised the Kennedys. Whatever went wrong in Marcello's life, he blamed RFK. Marcello would make a fortune for the entire national mafia and his own family. One day, his boss, Silver Dollar Sam, came to visit Marcello's new house. That house that Marcello had recently purchased was on private property, and the acres it sat on was larger than what Silver Dollar Sam owned and lived on. Sam knew then that Marcello was going to be the boss. Silver Dollar Sam was deported in 1945. In Italy, he became heavily involved in the world of narcotics, especially heroin trafficking. He had his men back in New Orleans, Louisiana, distributing it on his behalf. Another bit of business that Silver Dollar Sam used to do for Carlos Marcello was send him orphans. Marcello was known as an orphan killer. He used orphans to conduct his hits. The reason being was the fact that if anyone in Italy wanted to conduct retribution, they would come looking for Carlos Marcello and his crime family. But an orphan has no family, no loved ones, no one that cares about him. Therefore, he was expendable. They could use him as they wished. Marcello literally used to get orphans to run into places such as restaurants and public areas and have them carry out hits. The hitman would think there was a getaway car waiting for him. What he did not know was, there was a police officer waiting for him around the corner. As soon as that police officer heard the gunshots, he would then go running towards the crime scene and finish off the shooter. It was known as the Louisiana Patsy method. But I will get on to Carlos Marcello later. The world was changing, and the mafia were changing with it. They were now a powerful organization, the most ruthless in the world, and they were still in the shadows. Luciano was famous, and his men were in the papers like Adonis and Anastasia. Costello would be hit in Time magazine in 1949, but there were hundreds just like them that were low-key, and their names never appeared in the newspapers. $2 billion was being generated a year out of the state of Louisiana, $6 billion a year from Havana, Cuba, $10 billion from New York. Vegas was 3 years old. But these men owned all the gambling, unions, industries, entertainment, the movie industry, and more, including narcotics. Luciano had his passport given back to him. His Italian passport was good for Europe. So he traveled to London to look for gambling spots. Gambling was still illegal in the UK. Charlie knew it would be legal soon. He wanted to be involved. It was the 50s and Charlie was still head of his outfit. Maya was the guest who was joining him. Both men would meet and talk about investments. Lots of markets were being opened, especially in Europe, with countries looking for investment after the end of the Second World War. Mobsters poured in. Narcotics was starting to become huge also. The number of money and industries these men were involved was insane, and the new emerging industries that were coming up. Time in Havana, Cuba, did not last long. Charlie Luciano would be exiled twice in the year of 1946. In 1951, Luciano had just booked himself into a hotel. He was waiting for another guest who would soon be joining him. He booked himself into this hotel under the name Salvatore Lucania. That was his birth name. He would wear a grey suit, a hat, and glasses. The hotel was called the White House near Hyde Park, London. The New York Mafia had finally done the unthinkable. They had gone international. In my doc, I will show Luciano's time in Europe in part 4 and 5. It is crazy how big the Mafia became and his feelings in Cuba, Kennedy, and more. 15-10-23.